Hello everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode we look at Euripides' most famous and enduring play, the Bacchae. Euripides wrote in an anxious and transformative age. The Persians had just been defeated, and Athens, Athena, had ascended as the premier power among the Greeks. Euripides was but a young man when Athens ascended to her infamous glory that still mesmerizes and haunts our civilization today. The Athenian Empire, as recounted by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War, was exceptional because it was not the product of conquest, but of mutual defense. No other empire, the Athenian delegates argue in the History of the Peloponnesian War, had ever been formed in such a manner. But the later plays of Euripides, including the Bacchae, are set in dire and dark times. Athens' grand Sicilian conquest had failed. The Peloponnesian War had turned against Athens, and the city was suffering from civil war, sexual depravity, and the general disintegration of its society. Euripides might be reaching back to ancient and mythological figures, but their tales and fates are eerily similar to Athens at the end of the 5th century, on the eve of the great tragedian's death. The darkness of Euripides' tragedies coincides with the nadir of Athenian grandeur. It is well known that many of his plays composed during the Peloponnesian War, like the Trojan Women, are veiled commentaries on the state of Athenian society and the war itself. The Athens celebrated by Athena and the transformed Furies at the end of Aeschylus's Eumenides, and the Athens eulogized by Pericles in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, is not the Athens that Euripides composed his late plays to reflect. The Bacchae, among the last of Euripides' plays, was composed in a tumultuous city filled with strife and conflict. And though the play is set in Thebes, the tragedy that befalls Pentheus is an esoteric commentary on the state of Athenian society and the insufficiency of the gods of Athens. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, of reason and persuasion, alongside being a strong goddess of war. But her wisdom and justice are what primarily define her. And that her name is borne by Athens, Athens is supposed to be the wise and just city, in mere reflection of its patron deity, which exonerated Orestes and the transformed Furies. Something wicked comes to Greece. This is the reality of the situation when the Bacchae opens. Dionysus travels in from the eastern lands of the Orient. Dionysus, though a nominally Greek god, is presented by Euripides as if a foreign oriental sex god of conquest. Moreover, the power of Dionysus is immediately made known to the crowd or the reader. I come from Lydia, its territories teeming with gold, and from rich Phrygia. I am all conqueror in the sun-beaten steppes of Persia, the walled cities of Bactria, the wintry lands of Medea, and Arabia Felix, land of the blessed. All Asia is mine, and along the fringes of the sea, the pinnacled glory of all those mingled cities of Greeks and many races. Everywhere Dionysus goes, he conquers. No land, whether south, east, north, or now west, can escape the consuming madness of Dionysus, Bacchus, and the Bacchantes. We may have now forgotten, but it certainly wasn't lost on 5th century Athenians, that dancing is an intrinsically sexual act. Dancing is the great rite, the grand ritual that Dionysus brings with him. As Dionysus proclaims, "Elsewhere, everywhere, I have established my sacraments and dances to make my godhead manifest to mortals." Elsewhere, indeed, the chorus which lauds over Dionysus sings, "For sacred dances and joy, in the mountains the wild delight of Bacchus in his soul. His ritual he undergoes, Cybele's orgies, great mothers, he shakes the thyrus on from high." The women of Thebes are entranced, as if sex slaves, by this new god and his rituals. They lose their clothes and their minds, dancing and howling wildly on the mountain at night. The social order of the city is so threatened that Pentheus orders Dionysus arrested and his men prepared for battle to end his threat. Pentheus, as the king of Thebes, has a duty to protect his citizens and the social fabric and order of his civilization, which he correctly perceives to be threatened by the arrival of Dionysus. It is now well accepted that Euripides did not have a change of heart late in life. Euripides had always been critical of the gods. He was, at the eve of his death, still critical of the gods. We might say that among all of the Greek playwrights, Euripides is certainly the most sacrilegious. Moderns may be sympathetic to Dionysus, but Dionysus is hardly presented in any sympathetic light by Euripides. The modern reading of fun-loving Dionysus and stern Pentheus is not what Euripides was actually communicating, and it certainly was not what the 5th century audience of Athens would have seen on the stage. Euripides sees little good in Dionysus after he viciously and brutally turns on Pentheus, intoxicating the king who giggles like a little girl and dresses like a woman to get a better view of the naked women of the city in their entranced ritual dancing and moaning. Pentheus, however, is not without his fault. But as the play reaches its climax, we grieve for Pentheus, his mother, and his grandfather, but hardly shed a tear for Dionysus. In fact, we turn on Dionysus and wish to tear him limb from limb, just as the Titans had done to him in the past. The contemporary reading of fun-loving Dionysus against the power-imposing Pentheus misses the obvious and more contextual reality of the play. Both Dionysus and Pentheus are engaged in an exercise of power and will, and not freedom versus tyranny, as post-World War II readings tend to now assert, though we can understand, in a certain sense, why post-World War II readings are so bad. Dionysus is supposed to represent liberal America and the advancement of freedom. Pentheus is interpreted as the fascistic state, trying to impose tyranny over freedom. However, as mentioned, this clearly misses the 5th century context in which the play was written and the context to which the Greek audience would have understood the play. The contemporary reading of fun-loving Dionysus against power-imposing Pentheus misses the fact that what we are witnessing is an engagement of power and power. The power of Pentheus versus the power of Dionysus. It is not power versus liberty, but power versus power in a struggle to the death. Pentheus may have acted with impiety toward this foreign oriental sex god, but Pentheus certainly had the foresight, as the play reveals by his grisly dismemberment at the hands of the woman of the play, including his own mother, of the threat that Dionysus posed to civilization. In Pentheus challenging Dionysus, the king is not challenging the free-loving and free-playing Dionysus, as moderns erroneously interpret, but challenging Dionysus's lust for control and power, which leads to death and destruction. After all, when Dionysus is introduced, he proclaims his power of conquest and that of the world, sans Greece, which has been brought under his dominion. The contest between Pentheus and Dionysus is one of power. Pentheus understands the arrival of this foreign sex-crazed god as a threat to his power, but also the power and social order of Thebes and of human civilization. Dionysus, in seeing Pentheus's seriousness in gathering his armies for battle and clearing out the mountains of the Bacchae, understands that his power is being threatened by Pentheus. Sacrilege and impiety are mere pretexts to kill the king, which is precisely what Dionysus concludes must happen for his power, not his free-loving and free-playing spirit, to survive, which will allow him to conquer Thebes and the rest of Greece. Irrespective of the reception and development of Dionysus in the subsequent Greek tradition, the Dionysus of Euripides is a cold, lustful, and power-hungry dark god of vindictive cruelty. Dionysus is a god of dark fear and manipulation. His dark presence fills Pentheus with fear, and when Pentheus challenges Dionysus's arrival, he manipulates the king to be torn limb from limb by his sex-crazed induced dancers. Euripides' gods are not the gods of Aeschylus or Sophocles, though they bear the same name. No, Euripides' gods are the gods of Hesiod, given a new, cunning, and manipulative makeover. Furthermore, they are depicted as clear threats to the human social order. At least Hesiod's gods fought among themselves and castrated the bodies and organs of fellow immortals, instead of ripping humans limb from limb, with their entrails spilling out onto the laps of fanatically enraptured servants, mothers, fathers, and grandparents. As it is said at the end of the Bacchae, what is the result of Dionysus's conquest? Whore, I see whore, terrible whore. And whore is what Dionysus brings. Euripides, we can say, is a humanist. He believes in the power of human sociality and human rituals, not those of the gods which bring death and destruction to human society. The Bacchae, thus, isn't a play detailing the tyranny of Pentheus and the liberty and the freedom of Dionysus. It is representing the power between human sociality, represented by Pentheus, and the dark, cynical conquests of foreign gods and theology, represented by Dionysus, who once conquers the people, leads to a society tearing itself apart in ecstasy, as we see Pentheus ripped limb from limb. Euripides, therefore, writes a tragedy warning us against the craze to embrace new fads, esoteric mystery cults. However imperfect the human social order is, as represented by Pentheus, it is ultimately the only place where human love and life can flourish.